I'd like to thank the conference organisers and Mainstream for inviting me to come along and talk today. And before I go too far, I think it's probably important to just explain a little bit about my own background, because this conference is all about sustaining jobs and creating employment opportunities. I'm actually Wexford born and bred, which is always a difficult thing to say in County Offaly when you're about to embark on another hurling campaign, but I live with that. I'm educated in Ireland, and I've about 18 years experience in consenting and environmental impact assessment of large-scale infrastructure projects. The earlier part of my career, and essentially where I learned my trade, was within Bord na Móna, and I was involved in a multiple of energy projects for Bord na Móna. And since I left Bord na Móna, I now work for a large global organisation. And the skills that I have and the skills that my own team have, who are all trained and skilled and educated in Ireland, has meant that the skills that we have are in demand from my employer across large areas of the globe. And I'm currently involved in the delivery of multiple projects, not only in Ireland and the UK, but places such as Norway, the Caribbean, South Africa, Europe as well. So in my own experience, the opportunities that present themselves here are real and material. In the context of who Mott MacDonald are, they're a large multi-sector disciplinary organisation, and essentially our history in delivery of power generation projects goes back to 1890, and we're currently working in 140 countries worldwide. And I'm glad to see that there were a number of projects which we've been involved with for a number of clients who are in this room at the moment, such as the Bord na Móna Derry Green, a gas-fired power plant, and the Mount Lucas project are all projects which my staff are actively involved with on an ongoing basis. We have been working in Ireland since 1954, and probably one of the credits to our firm is that we've brought through more energy projects through the strategic infrastructure process in Ireland than any other firm. So from a generation perspective, we've been involved in thousands of megawatts on onshore wind and about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in places as inhospitable as the Irish Sea, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea and the English Channel. And in terms of cables and interconnectors and what's known as HVDC technology, we're involved in lots of projects interconnecting Ireland and the UK and France and Scotland and Norway. So it's a very exciting space to be in. Now, turning to the subject matter of this presentation, which is the very charming subject matter of consents and permitting, you could tell by looking at John Riley's face in terms of his presentation on Mount Lucas that this is a very challenging area, and it's a high-risk area for the development of projects, and quite rightly so, in my opinion, because this is a democracy that we work in, and we need to have robust systems in place to ensure that projects which are designed and constructed are sustainable. So initially, when we tend to hear about projects, there tends to be the large splash when you throw the stone into the pool for the first time. And projects getting through that initial planning process can take anywhere from 5 to 10, even to 15 years when you look at the oral hearing process and ultimately the judicial review process, which is the statutory entitlement to continue. But even when you have planning permission, and you'll have noticed this from the images in relation to Mount Lucas, there are material issues which need to be managed during the construction phase, which require a whole raft of secondary consents, such as road opening licenses, abnormal load permits when you're trying to maneuver big loads around narrow streets, also derogation licenses for protected species under the Habitats Directive and the Wildlife Acts. There's really an eye-watering list of consents which really don't stop at planning. They need to continue right through the construction phase of the project. And also, as has been mentioned on a number of occasions, the funding agencies are material stakeholders in these projects. And we have large drivers on international projects from investment banks such as KfW or the European Investment Bank, and they want to be sure that the environmental and social impact assessment of delivery of these projects has been comprehensively addressed. From a project delivery process then, there are complex gears and mechanisms which we've built up in this state, and while there are individual government policies and plans in terms of deliverable of renewable energy projects, sometimes these cogs don't turn in the same directions as the agencies who have responsibility for promoting sustainable growth and protecting the features of the natural environment. So what's really key is to try and get all of the stakeholders to move in the same direction towards the delivery of a successful outcome for a project. From an environmental perspective, in the classic sense of it, when you deliver a project like Energy Bridge, there are really a number of different complicated and complex environmental systems which need to have had due regard to. So we're very familiar with the terrestrial impacts. People have spoken about landscape and visual impact assessment. You've seen pictures of huge excavations for foundation of turbines, but also when you want to export electricity through a submarine cable, you're trying to get cable landing points on sensitive habitats such as coastal and dune areas and exposed cliffs which have niche ecological sensitivities. And you also have large areas of tidal interranges where you've got particular species and vegetation which are protected under European legislation. And in addition, all the time there's prevailing European legislation in the background, such as the Water Framework Directive or the Marine Strategy Framework, which is set in place to make sure that projects are sustainable and that they protect the assets which we have as a state and Europe has as a collective. So in terms of construction and environmental challenges, it's important to note that we talk about these projects, and it's hard to get a feel for the scale of them when you look at a layout plan on a project. But as was articulated in the case of the Mount Lucas project, turbines can be large structures, particularly when you're standing at the base and trying not to fall over or when you're trying to see the top of them. But these are significant projects with significant construction risks. I mean, the project, or the turbine on the left, gives an example of a scale of how big turbines can actually be. The middle photograph there is an example of a jack-up barge in an intertidal area and also a machine for laying a cable trench. And the third image on the right-hand side is an image of a cable-laying vessel. So these are substantial infrastructure projects which present their own individual challenges. So arising from those challenges, we're all familiar with very controversial projects which have been delivered in Ireland which have encountered their own difficulties. And without labouring on those, we need to learn from those experiences and make sure that we carry those experiences forward to make sure that projects are successfully delivered within a reasonable time frame in the country. From a planning and environmental impact assessment point of view, the Irish state has had 5 rulings against it at this stage by the European Court of Justice for inadequate transposition of the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. So it means we are not doing this legislation correctly. And the latest attempt by the state to give advice and guidance on this has resulted in the publication of new environmental impact assessment guidelines for local authorities as recently as last month. This puts a significant onus on the planning authority to conduct its own environmental impact assessment on the basis of the information which is provided by the developer. So as a consequence, it's extremely important that developers of the projects obtain the data, present the data in a reasonable manner to the local authority or the planning authority to help them make an informed opinion. Because ultimately, where planning and environmental legislation is going is ensuring that there's an auditable paper trail for the decision-making process within the planning authorities. Another element which is receiving considerable focus is appropriate assessment in the Habitats Directive in Ireland. Essentially 12% of the land mass or the land area of Ireland is protected under European ecological protection legislation. And there is a requirement on planning authorities to have due regard to the nature conservation implications of projects in the receiving environment. This is not a subordinate assessment, and it needs to be considered as related but standalone. And it does have material consequences for delivery of projects, because there was a decision made in the last number of weeks on the Galway Outer Bypass, which has yet again found complications and ineffectiveness in the delivery decision-making process in Ireland. The third element that I'd like to go into then is just to make reference to the Aarhus Convention. It's a very significant international convention which was signed as an international treaty in 2001, but was actually only formally ratified last summer. This is a significant development for people who have concerns in relation to projects, and essentially gives them a vehicle to get access to what they call the 3 pillars of the Aarhus Convention, which is access to environmental information, access to public participation, and access to environmental justice. This will start to bite on projects, and there's been an office set up called the Office of the Commissioner for Environmental Information. And the Commissioner for Environmental Information is Emily O'Reilly, who I believe is actually a Tullamore native. So no doubt she will be busy as projects such as this are presented to them. So ultimately, to close out then in terms of the supply chain, As you can get a feel from the previous presentations and my presentation, there are a number of different skills and competencies which are required to deliver these projects, be it geotechnical engineering, civil engineering, marine engineering, ecologists, ornithologists, geologists, but also other stakeholders such as landowners, communicators, the media, public and government representatives. And my opinion is that when you look at the supply chain, and all of these service providers want to get a benefit from the supply chain, they need to realize that they have to add value to that supply chain and participate in a meaningful manner to ensure that the project is delivered to the benefit of all stakeholders. Thank you.